Hello, my name is Sherlock Holmes, and every story hides a truth. Welcome to my new mystery.
The clock on Baker Street struck 12 when the knock came. A hesitant, trembling sound, barely audible beneath the steady hum of London's midnight rain. Dr. Watson looked up from his journal, the candlelight flickering across his weary face. Holmes, half reclined in his armchair, had been motionless for nearly an hour, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on the smoldering remains of his pipe tobacco. The silence broke with another knock, firmer this time but no less urgent. Holmes did not move. "Watson," he murmured without looking up, "that, I believe, is no ordinary visitor." The rhythm of her knock is uneven, fearful yet determined. A woman, young judging by the softness of the sound and the delay between strikes. Something has driven her here in great distress and likely not of a domestic nature. Let her in. Watson crossed the room and opened the door to reveal a pale figure drenched by the rain. She could not have been more than 25. Fair, with eyes wide from anxiety and cold. In her gloved hand she clutched a small brass object that gleamed even in the dim gaslight. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "you must forgive the intrusion at this hour, but I had nowhere else to go. My name is Clara Whitmore. My father, he's dead, and yet I cannot believe it was by his own hand." Holmes's head turned slightly. He motioned her toward the chair opposite him. "Please, Miss Whitmore, sit. You are quite safe here. Now tell us, what brings you to that conclusion?" Her hands shook as she placed the brass pocket watch on the table. "This was found in his hand when they discovered him. But it's wrong, all wrong." Watson leaned closer. The object was indeed a pocket watch, beautifully crafted, its casing engraved with intricate filigree. But something about it was peculiar. The second hand moved backward, each tick pulling time in reverse. Holmes's eyes sharpened. He leaned forward, watching the strange motion with fascination. "Extraordinary," he whispered. "A watch that defies time itself. Tell me, does it ever stop?" "Yes," she said quickly, "but only when I lie. That's why I came. It's as though it knows." Watson frowned. "Nonsense, Miss Whitmore. Surely some mechanical fault." Holmes raised a hand. "No, Watson. There are no coincidences in the world of mechanism, only purpose disguised as error." He picked up the watch delicately, tilting it toward the light. The ticking faltered for a moment, then resumed. "The metal is still warm, though it's been raining for hours. Curious. Your father, he was a clockmaker, you said?" "Yes, sir. He owned Whitmore's Clockworks on Fleet Street. He'd been acting strangely these past months, locking himself in his workshop late into the night, sending away his apprentices. 2 days ago I went to bring him supper and found the shop in darkness. The door was bolted from the inside. When they broke it open, he was there, lifeless beside his workbench, this watch in his hand. They said it was a heart attack, but..." Her voice faltered. There was smoke in the air like something had burned. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the fireplace, his coat brushing against the back of his chair. "Watson, do you observe? A craftsman dies surrounded by his own tools, and yet a device remains active in his hand, one that defies his own creation's principles. The warmth of the metal, the backward ticking, the woman's claim that it reacts to deceit. There is intelligence behind this, not chance." He turned back to Clara. "Miss Whitmore, did your father have any enemies, or clients of unusual persuasion?" She hesitated. "There was one man, a Colonel Armitage. He came often, always after hours. They argued once about payment, I think. Father said something about a contract that should never have been signed. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then he seemed haunted." Holmes smiled faintly, the kind of smile Watson had come to associate with the scent of revelation. "Colonel Armitage," he mused. "Retired engineer, formerly of Her Majesty's Army, known for his fascination with automata and mechanical illusions, a collector of curiosities, and more importantly, a man accustomed to having his will obeyed." He turned the watch over, tracing the engraving along its rim. Hidden beneath the ornate design was a faint inscription, almost invisible in the candlelight. Holmes fetched his magnifying lens and murmured, "Tempus mentitur, time lies." Intriguing choice of words. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window. Outside, the rain thickened to a steady pour, drumming against the glass like the ticking of 100 clocks. Holmes replaced the watch on the table and fixed Clara with his unwavering gaze. "You did well to come here, Miss Whitmore. I fear your father's death is but the beginning of a far more elaborate design." Watson looked uneasy. "Holmes, surely we can't assume murder from a mere anomaly in a watch, can we not?" Holmes replied. "You saw it yourself, Watson. The device obeys no known law of mechanics. That alone is enough to suggest tampering, and where there is tampering, there is intent." He paused. "Miss Whitmore, tomorrow morning you will take us to your father's shop. I should like to examine the scene myself before the police tidy away the evidence." She nodded, relief mingled with exhaustion. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I'll return at dawn." After she departed, Holmes stood at the window, his silhouette framed by the dim city lights. Watson joined him quietly, watching the rain cascade down the fogged glass. "You believe there's more to this than grief, then?" Holmes's eyes never left the street. "Watson, when a craftsman builds something that defies the very rules he devoted his life to mastering, and dies with it in his hand, we are not looking at grief. We are looking at a message." He turned, his voice lowering. "The question is, to whom was it sent?" Holmes lifted the watch once more, and as if in answer, the ticking stopped. For an instant the room fell completely silent, the air heavy with something unseen, something waiting. Then faintly from deep within the brass casing, a second tick echoed, softer, slower, and began again, backward. Holmes's expression darkened with fascination. "You see, Watson, even time itself protests when truth is near." He placed the watch upon the mantel and sat once more, eyes glinting in the dying firelight. "Tomorrow we go to Fleet Street. Let us see what secrets the dead clockmaker left behind in the gears of his final creation." Outside, the bells of St. Paul's struck one. The backward watch ticked once more, not in rhythm but in warning. Dawn crept reluctantly over London, its gray light filtering through a curtain of mist that clung to the streets like breath upon glass. The morning air carried the faint hum of carriage wheels and the distant toll of church bells. Yet Fleet Street seemed unnaturally still, as though the city itself hesitated to disturb the secrets lying within Whitmore's clockworks. Holmes walked with quick, measured strides, his coat drawn tight against the chill, his keen eyes scanning every facade, every shadow. Watson followed close behind, his boots echoing on the wet cobblestones, the ghost of last night's mystery still lingering in his mind. When they reached the clockmaker's shop, the sight was as Miss Whitmore had described. The shutters were drawn, the door's lock crudely broken and then haphazardly repaired. Above them, the painted sign, "Whitmore's Clockworks, Master of Time and Mechanism," hung slightly askew, its once gilded letters dulled by soot and rain. Holmes paused at the threshold, running his gloved fingers along the doorframe. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The hinges are newly oiled. Someone has entered since the police left, and not by force. Whoever it was had a key." Watson frowned. "You think Miss Whitmore came here again?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "No, her demeanor was too genuinely anxious. She feared this place. Whoever returned did so with purpose, not grief." He pushed open the door and they stepped inside. The interior was a cathedral of silence. Hundreds of clocks, grand and small, gilt and wooden, lined the walls, their faces frozen at different hours. A fine layer of dust clung to the floorboards, yet near the counter a distinct trail of fresh footprints led toward the back room. Holmes bent low, his eyes narrowing. Two sets of prints, one male, heavy step, likely boots, the other lighter, finer, possibly female, both recent. The dust is still unsettled. They followed the tracks into the workshop. It was a narrow space filled with workbenches, shelves of gears and springs, and the faint metallic scent of oil. The broken remains of a clock lay scattered across the floor. Holmes's gaze darted from one corner to another, absorbing every detail with predatory precision. "There," he said softly, pointing to a smudge along the base of a cabinet. "Smoke residue. Miss Whitmore mentioned a burnt smell, and it lingers still. But look closer, Watson. Not soot, gunpowder." Watson crouched, rubbing the blackened dust between his fingers. "Gunpowder? In a clockmaker's shop?" Holmes tapped a finger to his lips. "Or rather, in an inventor's laboratory. Mr. Whitmore was crafting something far beyond the art of timekeeping." On the main workbench, amid the clutter of tools, lay a half-assembled automaton, a mechanical figure of brass and iron, humanoid in form but incomplete. Its face was featureless, its chest cavity open, exposing a complex network of gears that glimmered faintly in the morning light. At its center, a space seemed deliberately left empty, as though awaiting a final, crucial piece. Watson leaned closer, examining the craftsmanship. Remarkable detail. Almost lifelike if one were to complete it. But what was he building it for? Holmes's eyes had drifted to a small drawer beneath the bench. With a swift motion, he pulled it open, and inside lay a stack of yellowed papers, sketches drawn in fine pencil. He spread them out across the table. Blueprints, he said, for a device not yet completed. But note the design, not for movement, but for precision and timing. Each gear measures the increment of a second reversed. This mechanism, Watson, could theoretically record events as though they occurred backward in time. Watson blinked. Backward? You mean, imagine a clock that not only measures moments but manipulates their record. An illusion of reversal, a trick of sequence. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Whitmore was attempting to construct a device that could falsify time itself. Before Watson could reply, a faint creak echoed from the stairway behind them. Both men turned sharply. Holmes's hand slipped beneath his coat. The shadow of movement flickered on the wall and then silence. Holmes gestured for Watson to stay put and advanced soundlessly toward the stairs. He moved like a cat, each step deliberate, his eyes fixed upward. When he reached the landing, he called quietly, "Who's there?" The reply was a low, nervous whisper, female, trembling. "Please, don't shoot." Miss Whitmore emerged from the gloom, her face pale and drawn. I had to come," she said, her voice breaking. "When I left last night, I couldn't sleep. I thought maybe there was something here, something my father left behind." Holmes's expression softened, though his gaze remained sharp. "And you found?" She hesitated, glancing toward the automaton. "Only that, and this." She held out a folded letter, its edges smudged with oil. Holmes took it carefully and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but hurried. "To my dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then my invention is no longer safe. The Colonel means to use it for purposes I cannot allow. Should he find me gone, he will come for the prototype. The key to it lies within the watch, but not the one you know. Trust only the one that ticks backward." Holmes reread the letter twice, his expression darkening. "So the Colonel's involvement is confirmed, and the mention of another watch, a prototype. This shop may hold its twin." He began to search, moving with surgical precision, tapping floorboards, checking drawers, tracing the edges of walls for hidden seams. Watson and Clara watched in silence. Finally, Holmes stopped before the tall grandfather clock standing against the far wall. Its pendulum was still, but the casing bore faint scratches as if recently tampered with. "Ah," Holmes murmured. He pressed a concealed latch beneath the dial. The panel swung open to reveal a narrow compartment, and within it a second watch, identical to Clara's save for one difference. This one ticked forward. Holmes held it in one hand, the backward watch in the other. The two rhythms pulsed in opposition, forward and reverse, an endless duel of time. "Watson," he said softly, "we stand in the midst of a paradox. Two watches, one that lies and one that tells the truth. Or perhaps one that reveals the lie." Before Watson could answer, a sudden crash shattered the silence, glass breaking at the front of the shop. Holmes spun around. "Get down!" A shot rang out. The bullet tore through the window frame, lodging in the opposite wall. Clara gasped, falling to her knees. Holmes darted to the counter, peering through the jagged opening. Across the street, through the fog, a figure in a gray coat vanished into the mist. Holmes's voice was low but steady. "Watson, we have just met Colonel Armitage." They waited until the sound of footsteps faded, then Holmes straightened, his eyes alive with purpose. "He knows we found the second watch. That means he believes we are close to understanding Whitmore's design, and he will not stop until he retrieves it." He placed both watches carefully into his coat pocket. Time, it seems, is now our enemy as much as our ally. As they stepped out of the ruined shop, the fog thickened once more, swallowing the street in silence. The clocks within Whitmore's workshop began to tick again, one by one, slowly, as if waking from sleep. But among them one remained motionless, the great-grandfather clock, its hands fixed eternally at midnight. Holmes glanced back only once before turning the corner. "Come, Watson," he said. "The Colonel has moved his piece. It is our turn upon the board." The fog lay thick over London, clinging to the gas lights like a ghost unwilling to depart. The early morning rain had subsided, leaving the streets slick with reflection, every window pane shimmering with the fractured glow of the waking city. Holmes and Watson walked in silence through the narrow lanes toward Baker Street, their breath misting in the cold air. Behind them, Fleet Street faded into the murk, but the echo of that single gunshot lingered, a reminder that their pursuer had not fired to kill, but to warn. Holmes's stride was deliberate, his head slightly bowed, eyes lost in thought. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "our adversary does not fear discovery and only delay." His shot was intended to ensure we move swiftly, to drive us along a path of his own design, a clever tactic. "It confirms he knows I despise being manipulated." Watson gave a half-smile. "Then he's made a grave mistake. You'll not dance to another man's tune?" "On the contrary," Holmes replied softly. "Sometimes the most efficient route to the truth is to appear to follow one's opponent's choreography, until the final step." He stopped suddenly, glancing behind. The street behind them was empty, yet he spoke in a tone that carried a quiet satisfaction. "He's been trailing us since we left Fleet Street. Third lamppost on the right, just beyond the newspaper stand. A gray coat, a felt hat moving at intervals of exactly 20 paces. Watson turned subtly. Indeed, through the thinning fog, a tall figure lingered near the lamppost, motionless, pretending to read a folded paper. His presence was too still, too deliberate. Holmes adjusted his pace. "We shall not confront him here. Let him believe we are unaware. I'm curious how far he dares to follow." They continued toward Baker Street, making no sign of alarm. When they reached the door of 221B, Holmes paused to unlock it, and in the reflection of the brass knocker, Watson glimpsed the faint shadow of the man across the street. The figure tipped his hat almost courteously, then turned and vanished into the fog. Inside, Mrs. Hudson met them with her usual morning composure, though she raised an eyebrow at their damp coats and soot-streaked boots. "Another long night, Mr. Holmes?" "Indeed, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied absently, "and I fear the morning will prove no shorter." He shed his coat and went straight to his desk, removing from his pocket both the forward and backward ticking watches. The faint ticking filled the room, one steady and natural, the other discordant, pulling time apart like twin heartbeats out of rhythm. Watson seated himself by the fire. "You think Armitage sent that man to follow us?" Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling in lazy spirals above his head. "Almost certainly. The colonel is a strategist by nature. His habits during his service in the Royal Engineers are well documented. A man who views every move as part of a campaign. He will use intimidation, misdirection, and patience in equal measure. But one fact troubles me. He chose to reveal himself so soon. That is not his usual method." "Then what does it mean?" "It means," Holmes said quietly, "that something is happening behind the scenes. Something he fears I might uncover before he is ready." He tapped the forward ticking watch against his palm thoughtfully. "And I intend to discover what that is." At that moment, a knock sounded. Holmes turned sharply. Punctual as I hoped. When the door opened, Inspector Lestrade entered, his coat dripping rain onto the carpet. "Holmes," he greeted, sounding faintly irritated. "I've been told you've been nosing around a death scene that's still under police inquiry." "Care to explain?" Holmes smiled faintly. "You refer, I presume, to the unfortunate demise of Mr. Whitmore, the clockmaker. Tell me, Lestrade, have you determined what killed him?" Lestrade frowned. "Heart failure, according to the medical examiner. No wounds, no sign of struggle?" "Indeed," Holmes murmured, pacing toward the window. "Yet I find it strange that a man of robust health should perish suddenly in a sealed room surrounded by his life's work, and leave behind a device that contradicts the very nature of time." Lestrade blinked. "A device?" Holmes held up the backward ticking watch. "Observe. The second hand runs in reverse, the mechanism unaltered by any visible tampering. Would you call that a coincidence, Inspector?" Lestrade leaned forward, squinting. "A trick, perhaps. Tricks are for magicians," Holmes said coolly. "This was the work of an engineer, and possibly a murderer." He snapped the case shut and placed it on the mantel. "Tell me, Lestrade, did your men find any trace of another individual in the shop that night?" Lestrade hesitated. "No fingerprints, but yes, there was one thing. Boot prints near the rear entrance. Military issue, heavy tread. Too large to belong to Whitmore. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Excellent. Then we are no longer chasing a shadow. He crossed to his desk and unfolded one of Whitmore's sketches, the blueprint marked with precise circles and timing notations. You see these markings here, Watson? They indicate intervals of delayed ignition, mechanical detonation timed to the second. Whitmore was constructing not merely a clock, but a mechanism for manipulation, a device capable of falsifying time sequences. Imagine, Lestrade, a crime committed at noon that appears, by the clock's record, to have occurred an hour later. An alibi forged not by lies, but by the very laws of mechanism. Lestrade looked unsettled. You're saying someone could use this to alter the truth, Holmes finished, his tone grave. And that someone, I suspect, is Colonel Armitage. Watson frowned. But why go to such lengths? To what end? Holmes's expression hardened. Because, my dear Watson, the Colonel's past is riddled with incidents best forgotten. There were rumors of a failed experiment, an explosion during his service in the Sudan campaign that cost the lives of 2 men. The reports were adjusted. Perhaps he now seeks a way to erase such stains permanently. What better tool than a device that rewrites time itself? The clock on the mantel chimed once, a hollow, deliberate sound. Holmes glanced toward the window, where movement caught his eye. Across the street, just beyond the drizzle, the gentleman in the gray coat stood again, perfectly still, gazing up at the windows of 221B. Holmes strode to the glass. The man did not flinch beneath his stare. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but even from here, the cold precision of his stance betrayed military discipline. Lestrade followed Holmes's gaze. Good lords, is that him? Holmes nodded once. Colonel Armitage himself, or one of his agents. He wants us to see him, a move meant to unsettle. Should we go after him? Watson asked. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Not yet. Let him believe we remain cautious. A hunter who shows his face is never far from springing his trap, and when he does, I intend to be waiting on the other side of it. As they watched, the man in the gray coat turned, tipping his hat in a gesture almost mocking, and disappeared once more into the fog. Holmes's gaze lingered long after he was gone. The game has begun, he murmured, and our opponent is playing with time itself. He turned back to Lestrade and Watson, his voice steady, his eyes alive with thought. Gentlemen, I believe it is time we paid the good colonel a visit, before the clock strikes for another death. Outside, somewhere beyond the mist and chiming bells, a distant clock began to tick in perfect unison with the one upon Holmes's mantel, and for a fleeting instant, both watches in his pocket beat as one. Then, as if sensing one another's presence, their rhythms diverged, one forward, one back, and time once again began to fracture. The hansom cab rattled down the slick cobblestones, the fog swirling like pale smoke beneath the wheels. Holmes sat opposite Watson, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed, yet every jolt of the cab seemed to sharpen rather than dull his focus. The rhythmic clatter of hooves echoed against the narrow streets, merging with the muffled chime of distant clocks, a dozen timepieces, all slightly out of sync, as though the very city had begun to breathe irregularly. Watson studied him in the dim light. You're unusually silent, Holmes. I thought you'd have formed a dozen theories by now. Holmes's eyes flickered open. Only one, he said quietly, and I pray I'm wrong. Time itself, Watson, has become our adversary. Colonel Armitage's experiments have gone beyond deception. He is attempting to engineer death with precision. Watson frowned. You believe the device in Whitmore's shop was a weapon? Holmes gave a faint nod. Not in the ordinary sense. It is a mechanism of sequence and timing, a contrivance that releases lethal force at a predetermined instant, triggered not by human hand, but by the inexorable movement of the clockwork. Imagine a man killed in his study alone while the murderer is miles away. The clock strikes the hour, and the deed is done. No fingerprints, no witnesses, only the illusion of natural death. Watson shuddered. Good God. The cab lurched to a halt before a low, fog-draped warehouse on the banks of the Thames. A faint metallic tapping could be heard even above the hiss of the river. Holmes paid the driver and stepped out, his gaze narrowing at the faint orange light leaking from the upper windows. This, he murmured, is where the colonel hides his secrets. Observe, Watson. Even the night watchman's lantern burns too steadily, an artificial rhythm. They crossed the yard in silence, the wet stones reflecting distorted shapes of cranes and ropes. The door to the warehouse was secured by a heavy iron lock, yet a thin wire, almost invisible, ran from its latch up along the brickwork. Holmes traced it with his fingers, following it to a small brass capsule hidden behind a drain pipe. "Careless," he whispered. "A percussion trap, triggered when the door is forced." With delicate precision, he produced a thin blade and a pair of forceps from his pocket, cutting the wire at its joint. A faint click, and the tension in the air seemed to ease. "We may proceed." Inside, the air was thick with oil and the faint scent of burning ozone. Machinery filled the space. Clock faces without numbers, cogs that spun against invisible resistance, pendulums swaying though no air stirred. The sound was maddening, 1,000 tiny ticks forming a heartbeat that belonged to no living creature. Watson glanced uneasily around. "It's like stepping inside the lungs of some monstrous machine." Holmes moved with reverence, his eyes darting from one contraption to another. "Each piece serves a purpose," he murmured. "Each is part of a larger equation. Whitmore's genius, twisted under Armitage's command, has created something far beyond timekeeping." He stopped before a tall apparatus of glass and brass, its heart glowing faintly blue. Within it, a series of gears revolved at impossible speed, driving a piston that pulsed with almost biological rhythm. "Here," Holmes said, "is the mechanism of death, a device that measures life by pressure and release. When the final gear halts, the tension discharges, perhaps as a burst of gas, perhaps as a chemical vapor. Lethal, instantaneous, and timed to the second." Watson drew back in horror. "Then Whitmore's death was a test," Holmes finished grimly. "A demonstration. Armitage needed to see if his invention could kill without trace. Now that it has succeeded, he intends to perfect it." Footsteps echoed above, slow, deliberate, measured. Holmes lifted a finger for silence, slipping into the shadows between towering gears. Through the gaps in the machinery, they saw a tall man descending the iron staircase. The dim lamplight revealed a severe face, its features carved by discipline and pride. The gentleman in the gray coat, Armitage. He paused beside the apparatus, removing his gloves with mechanical precision. "Magnificent," he murmured to himself. Whitmore served his purpose well. The calibration was flawless, and not a heartbeat too soon. Holmes's voice broke the silence, calm yet cutting. "A pity your conscience doesn't share his precision, Colonel." Armitage froze, then turned slowly. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his tone almost amused, "I wondered how long it would take you." "I might ask the same of you," Holmes replied, stepping from the shadows. "You've waited nearly a decade to perfect your revenge. The Sudan affair, the deaths of your men, all hidden by doctored reports and altered timelines. And now you wish to rewrite history itself, to erase your guilt with the tick of a clock." The Colonel's eyes gleamed. "Guilt, Mr. Holmes, is a construct of those who fail. I have merely sought to prove that time, not man, dictates justice. The mechanism ensures balance. Those who wronged me will meet their end at the appointed hour." "Then you intend to kill again?" Holmes said softly. "I already have," Armitage replied. "Even now another of my accusers sits beneath my device. When the clock in his chamber strikes midnight, the mechanism will release its final breath. Nothing can stop it." "Not even you?" Holmes's expression hardened. "Where?" Armitage smiled faintly. "You'll never reach him in time." He turned, reaching toward the machine. "I think it's time to reset the sequence." Before his fingers touched the lever, Holmes moved. A single stride, a flash of motion, and the detective's hand closed over the Colonel's wrist, twisting it sharply. The two men struggled among the gears, the ticking rising to a feverish tempo. Watson darted forward, wrenching a wrench from a nearby table and striking the release valve. Steam hissed violently, filling the room. "Watson!" "The dial," Holmes shouted through the noise. "Turn it counterclockwise now." Watson spun the brass wheel, the gears grinding in protest. The glow inside the glass cylinder flickered, dimmed, then went out. Silence fell. Holmes shoved Armitage back, breathing hard. "You've built your own gallows, Colonel," he said quietly. "But I've cut the rope." Armitage straightened, his face pale but composed. "You think this ends it, Holmes? Time will not wait for your morality. I have other devices, other clocks already wound." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then I will stop them, every last one." Armitage smiled thinly, stepping backward toward the shadows. Perhaps. But tell me, Detective, when every clock in London strikes midnight tomorrow, how will you know which one kills? Before Holmes could reply, a burst of steam obscured the colonel's figure, and when it cleared, he was gone. Watson stared in disbelief. He's vanished! Holmes turned toward the now silent machine, his expression unreadable. No, Watson. He's merely keeping time. He looked toward the window where the first light of dawn touched the fog with crimson hue, and if my calculations are correct, London has less than 24 hours before the next mechanism strikes. The broken gears ticked once, just once, before falling still, and in that single beat of silence, Holmes knew the race against time had truly begun. The morning light that filtered through the fog was wan and cold, pale ribbons cutting across the cluttered interior of Baker Street. Holmes stood by the window, still in his dressing gown, one hand resting lightly on the mantelpiece as he stared out toward the waking city. The faint hum of carriages, the occasional bark of a dog, the clatter of hooves, the rhythm of London persisted, indifferent to the machinery of death ticking somewhere within its heart. Watson, seated at the breakfast table, watched Holmes with wary curiosity. The detective's pipe sat unlit on the sill, forgotten. His eyes were distant yet sharp, the kind of gaze that hinted at calculations too intricate for words. You haven't slept, Watson said, pouring himself tea. Neither, I imagine. Has the colonel, Holmes replied absently. Men who play with time rarely rest. The guiltless sleep soundly. The damned must listen to every tick of the clock. Watson sighed, folding the morning paper. The police are baffled. Inspector Lestrade believes Armitage has fled London entirely. Holmes smiled faintly without mirth. Lestrade believes what the evidence allows him to. But Armitage has not left, not yet. The man's vanity forbids it. He wishes to see the city bow to his precision. He'll be here until the last device completes its cycle. He turned from the window suddenly, his eyes gleaming.
Watson, do you recall the clock we recovered from Whitmore's shop?
The one with the damaged escapement? Watson nodded. Yes, you had it sealed in the drawer. Holmes crossed the room swiftly, unlocking the lower cabinet. He withdrew the timepiece. A modest brass carriage clock, its face cracked, the minute hand arrested between 11 and 12. This device, he said, holding it up to the light, was no ordinary piece of craftsmanship. Whitmore designed it under Armitage's instruction, but he altered the final gear. Look here, the tiniest deviation in alignment. Not an error, Watson, a message. He placed the clock upon the desk, fetched a magnifying lens, and bent close. Observe the engraving beneath the winding key. At first glance, a flourish of the maker's mark, but look closer. Watson leaned in, squinting. It appears to be letters? Precisely. CSR 315. Holmes straightened, his expression sharpening. A signature and a time. Whitmore must have left it as a final clue before his death. But what does it mean? Holmes began to pace. Whitmore was terrified yet devoted to his craft. He would never destroy his own creation, but he might have hidden its twin. The engraving suggests another device, one built before this prototype. CS, possibly a location. Clockmaker's Square, or perhaps Charing Street. He paused, tapping his fingers against the desk. And 315, and either a time or an address. Yes, Watson. It seems we must let the clock lead us. Within the hour, they were in a cab rattling south through the thickening fog. The city seemed to pulse with unease. Bells rang faintly through the haze, echoing across rooftops like warnings. Holmes leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. If my inference is correct, there is a device set to trigger tonight. Armitage's confidence was not the boast of a madman. It was the assurance of one who knows the hour of death as precisely as his own reflection. Do you think the next target is another of his accusers? Watson asked. Holmes nodded grimly. Colonel Price, a member of the same tribunal that condemned Armitage after the Sudan campaign. He lives on Charing Street. He glanced at his pocket watch, and if I am not mistaken, his household clock stopped last night at precisely 3:15. When they arrived, the heavy oak door of the townhouse stood ajar. Inside, a faint hum filled the air, metallic, rhythmic. Holmes motioned for silence, and they stepped cautiously into the dimly lit hall. The source of the sound came from the study, where a grand long-case clock stood against the wall, its pendulum swaying with unnatural speed. Holmes's face was grave. It's been altered. The tempo's too rapid and it's counting down, not measuring time. Watson's pulse quickened. Good heavens, can we stop it? Holmes moved quickly, scanning the mechanism with surgical precision. Not directly. The casing's been wired. Interference might detonate the hidden release. He crouched, inspecting the base. Gas tubes, likely. Armitage has integrated a timer that will rupture the canister once the cycle completes. Watson looked toward the mantelpiece. Holmes, look, there's a letter. Holmes rose and took it, breaking the seal with care. Inside, written in a cold, neat hand, were the words, "Every man measures his own end. When this clock stops, so does the past. No signature, only a single crimson fingerprint beneath the line." Holmes's eyes flicked to the door. Watson, clear the house, and now. Tell the servants to open every window, but you go. Watson obeyed, rushing down the corridor. Holmes remained before the clock, his mind racing. He retrieved a small tool from his pocket, a fine steel probe, and began tracing the inner rim of the pendulum case. The ticking grew faster. Somewhere inside the casing, a valve hissed. Steady now, he muttered. He's used a pressure lock tied to the motion of the escapement. If I can release it in rhythm. The ticking halted. A single click echoed through the room, followed by silence. Holmes froze, then exhaled as the pressure gauge settled. The device was disarmed. Watson returned moments later, breathless. Everyone's clear. Holmes turned the note in his fingers. Armitage is escalating. He's turned London itself into his timepiece. Every clock we pass may conceal a mechanism like this. The man's obsession is no longer scientific, it's theological. He seeks to make himself master of time and judgment. Watson looked stricken. Then how can we possibly find them all? Holmes's expression softened, almost with pity. We don't have to find them all. Only the first, the one that governs the rest. Armitage would not leave his own system beyond control. There will be a central regulator, a master device to synchronize the others. And Whitmore's clue points us toward it. He held up the brass clock again. The faint engraving shimmered in the lamplight, the hands still frozen between 11 and 12. He left us more than a message, Holmes murmured. He left us a map. If I'm correct, beneath this face lies a secondary dial, and within it, the coordinates of Armitage's final workshop. He turned the winding key, and with a soft metallic snap, the glass cover lifted. Beneath the first layer of brass lay another disc etched with tiny lines, concentric rings intersected by a single arrow. Holmes's eyes gleamed with revelation. Watson, it's not a time at all, he whispered. It's latitude and longitude. The colonel's lair lies beyond the docks and beneath the old Greenwich clock tower. Of course, where else would a man obsessed with time make his stand? Watson's jaw tightened. Then that's where we go. Holmes pocketed the clock, his face set with grim determination. Tonight at midnight, London's heartbeat will falter. And if we do not reach that tower before the final gear halts, the entire city will breathe its last in a cloud of invisible poison. They stepped into the fog once more, the faint chime of distant bells echoing through the streets, solemn, relentless, counting down to an hour that might never strike again. The carriage wheels clattered over the damp cobblestones, slicing through the fog that lay thick over the Thames. Holmes sat forward, eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Greenwich, its great tower looming like the shadow of a sleeping giant. The faint rhythm of his finger tapping against his knee matched the cadence of the cab's wheels. Fast, precise, relentless. Watson could tell that the detective's mind was racing far ahead of them, threading invisible lines between every fragment of the mystery they'd uncovered. The clock tower, Watson murmured, breaking the silence. Isn't it symbolic, Holmes? Greenwich, the very cradle of time itself. Holmes's lips curled in a thin smile. Precisely why Armitage chose it. For a man obsessed with control over time, what greater triumph than to turn its master clock into an instrument of death? But there is something more personal at play here, Watson. Whitmore's engraving wasn't merely a map, it was a farewell. The man knew his craft had been corrupted, and he tried in his final hours to leave behind a key. Watson frowned. A key to what? To redemption, Holmes replied quietly. And perhaps to Armitage's undoing. The cab jolted to a stop at the edge of the docks. The air was damp with salt and oil. The cries of distant gulls echoed faintly through the mist. Holmes stepped down first, his gaze sweeping across the deserted wharf until it settled on a narrow passage leading toward the base of the clock tower. Stay close, he murmured, If Whitmore's coordinates are correct, the entrance will be hidden near the foundation, likely through one of the maintenance shafts. The passageway was narrow and steep, its walls slick with condensation. A faint ticking grew louder as they descended, not from any single source but from everywhere, as though the very stones pulsed with machinery. At the end of the stairwell, a heavy metal door stood ajar, light flickering from within. Holmes paused, listening. A rhythmic whir, the grind of gears, the faint hiss of steam. "He's here," he said softly, "and the mechanism is running." Inside, the chamber was vast, an underground cathedral of brass and steel. Enormous gears interlocked like the teeth of some colossal beast, pistons moving in perfect unison. In the center of the hall stood a raised platform surrounded by a lattice of pipes, wires, and coils. At its heart, a single chair faced the glowing pendulum of the master clock. Seated there was Colonel Armitage. He did not turn as Holmes and Watson entered. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost reverent. "You are late, Mr. Holmes. The sequence has begun. In less than an hour, every calibrated mechanism across London will release its breath. 1,000 invisible deaths, synchronized by time itself." Holmes's voice carried across the chamber, low but sharp. "You've become the very thing you sought to control, Armitage. You believe you've mastered time, yet it has mastered you. Even now your invention enslaves you, every tick of the clock dragging you closer to your own destruction." Armitage laughed softly, still facing the pendulum. "You mistake me for a villain, Holmes, but I have transcended guilt, fear, even mortality. This is not murder, it is correction. The world took from me men who deserved to live and left alive those who thrived on deceit. I have merely restored balance. When the clocks strike midnight, justice will be done." Holmes stepped forward slowly, his keen eyes darting across the mechanism. "And yet you speak of justice as though it were a formula," he said. "Tell me, Colonel, did you calculate Whitmore's death too? The man who gave you the power to commit these acts, or was his sacrifice simply another line in your equation?" Armitage's hand tightened on the armrest. "He betrayed me. He tried to alter my design, to create a failsafe that would undo my work. I could not allow that." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And he succeeded." The colonel's head turned slightly. "What did you say?" Holmes lifted the brass carriage clock from his coat pocket and placed it on the nearest workbench. The dim light reflected off its cracked face, catching the colonel's eye. Whitmore's last act was to inscribe a cipher into his design, a reversal sequence. "Every one of your devices is tied to this master clock. Destroy it and the signal chain collapses." Armitage's composure faltered just for a heartbeat. "Impossible. I eliminated all redundancies. Even the most brilliant clockmaker," Holmes said, "cannot predict the one variable he refuses to acknowledge: conscience. Whitmore's engraving wasn't merely a message, it was a fail-safe command, hidden in the gear ratio of your prototype. I need only to turn the dial to 11:59 and wind it once." Armitage rose abruptly, the glint of madness in his eyes. "You'll do no such thing." Holmes met his gaze unflinchingly. "Then you'll have to stop me." The two men moved at once. Armitage lunging toward the platform, Holmes twisting aside, the two grappling amid the whirring machinery. Watson rushed forward but hesitated as steam burst from a ruptured valve, filling the room with blinding vapor. Through the haze, Holmes's voice cut like steel. "Watson, the clock, turn the key." Watson darted toward the bench. His hands trembled as he seized the brass clock and began to wind. The ticking grew louder, sharper, almost alive. Armitage roared, breaking free of Holmes's grasp and lunging toward Watson. Holmes intercepted him, the two crashing against the iron railing. The master pendulum began to tremble. Gears groaned, reversing their motion. Sparks flew as the rhythm of the great machine faltered, then slowed. Holmes forced Armitage against the railing, their faces inches apart. "It's over, Colonel. Your mechanism dies with its maker." Armitage's eyes burned. "Then let it take us both." With a final surge of strength, he tore himself free and hurled his weight toward the central control lever. Holmes lunged, catching his arm mid-swing. The two men hung for a breathless instant above the pit of turning gears. Then the lever snapped. The machinery screamed. Metal tore against metal as the gears ground to a halt, their motion dying in a single echoing pulse. The lights dimmed, the great pendulum slowed and stopped. Armitage staggered backward, collapsing against the railing. You've doomed everything, he gasped. Holmes straightened, breathing heavily. No, Colonel. You mistook the measure of time for the measure of man. The Colonel's gaze flickered toward the frozen clock, his expression almost peaceful. Then perhaps I was only ever keeping time for my own end. He sank to his knees, the weight of silence pressing down as the final hiss of steam faded. Watson hurried to Holmes's side. Are you hurt? Only my patience, Holmes replied, glancing toward the shattered mechanism. But I dare say London will see another dawn. They stood together amid the ruins of the Colonel's creation, the silence broken only by the faint drip of condensation. Holmes turned the small brass clock over in his hand, its ticking now perfectly steady once more. Whitmore's legacy endures, he said softly, a clockmaker who used time not to destroy but to preserve life. He understood what Armitage never could, that precision without mercy is merely madness in disguise. As they ascended back into the fog-drenched dawn, the first chime of morning echoed from above, the great clock of Greenwich striking the hour, its sound pure and steady. Holmes paused on the steps, his gaze distant. The irony, Watson, he murmured. In the end, it was not the mechanism that defined them, but the heart that wound it. And as the final echo of the chime faded into the river mist, London's heartbeat resumed, measured, fragile, and alive once more. The fog that had veiled the Thames since dawn clung stubbornly to the streets of London as Holmes and Watson emerged from Greenwich Tower. The city was stirring, yet unaware of how narrowly it had escaped catastrophe. The clock above them, its pendulum restored, struck the next hour with calm precision, its tone clear, resonant, and alive. For most Londoners, it was merely another morning. For Holmes, it was the echo of a victory won at the very edge of reason and mortality. Watson exhaled slowly, watching the mist curl around his breath. So it's done then. The city is safe. Armitage's madness ended. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the slow movement of the minute hand above. Safe, he murmured finally. Perhaps for now. But evil rarely dies in the hour it is struck down, Watson. It leaves impressions, scars on the very fabric of time. They began walking toward the cab stand, their boots echoing softly against the wet stone. The street lamps flickered dimly, their flames struggling against the mist. Holmes's expression was unreadable, his mind evidently still caught in the machinery of thought. Watson glanced at him. You're troubled, Holmes. I thought we had prevented his plan. Holmes's voice was measured, distant. Indeed, we prevented the mechanism's completion. But the Colonel's genius, deranged as it was, did not end with his death. His notes, his fragments, there were thousands of calculations scrawled across his workshop walls. If even a fraction of that knowledge escapes into the wrong hands... He trailed off. The cab arrived and they climbed inside. As the driver flicked the reins and the horses began their slow trot through the thickening fog, Watson looked out the window toward the dark river, uneasy. You believe someone else may try to continue his work? Holmes turned his gaze toward the carriage window, the dim reflection of his face overlapping with the passing street lamps. Armitage was not working alone. Watson's head turned sharply. Not alone? But the documents, the experiments, all bore his signature. Holmes smiled faintly, a shadow of satisfaction in his eyes. And yet the cipher Whitmore embedded within the clock, the reversal code, was not his handwriting. It was appended later by another hand, someone with a steady, deliberate precision, someone who knew exactly what would be needed to undo Armitage's design, should he lose control. You mean someone inside his circle? Precisely. The cab turned onto Baker Street. The familiar facade of 221B emerged from the fog, gaslights glimmering faintly through the windows. Mrs. Hudson must have heard the wheels, for by the time Holmes and Watson entered, the fire in the hearth was already roaring, and tea waited upon the table. Watson removed his coat and sat heavily in his chair, fatigue finally seeping through his bones. You're suggesting there's a third figure in all this, a silent partner. Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the shifting fog outside. Not merely a partner, Watson. An architect. Someone who understood both the mechanism and the man. Someone who guided Whitmore's conscience and Armitage's madness in equal measure. He turned, eyes gleaming in the dim light. You recall the inscription on the clock? Tempus me ducit? Time leads me. Watson nodded. It was Armitage's motto, indeed. but it appears twice, once on the clock's face, once hidden within the gear housing. The second version, however, had a subtle alteration. The Latin was imperfect. A deliberate flaw, Watson frowned. A flaw? A code, Watson. A signature. The hand of a woman, to be precise. Watson sat up. A woman. Holmes crossed to his desk and withdrew a single folded note. The paper was crisp, uncreased, and bore a faint scent of lavender oil. He laid it on the table. In delicate script, the message read, "When the hour strikes 12, all debts shall be balanced." Emma Watson stared. "Good heavens, Holmes. When did you receive this?" "Half an hour ago. Delivered by a boy in livery. No return address. The letter, surely it's a threat." Holmes's smile deepened. "No, Watson. It's an invitation." He moved toward the mantel, studying the flicker of the firelight across the polished brass of his magnifying glass. "You see, whoever M is, she knows that Armitage is dead, which means she was close enough to his design to feel its failure, and if my calculations are correct, she intends to finish what he began, though perhaps in a different form." Watson rose. "Then we must act, Holmes. The letter, when the hour strikes 12, that's tonight." Holmes nodded slowly. "Midnight, yes, which leaves us little more than 12 hours. The question is not where she will act, but how. Armitage's mechanism was destroyed, but time itself can be weaponized in other ways. Through communication, through synchronized sabotage, even through psychology." He began pacing. "A woman of intellect, boldness, and moral ambiguity. There are only a handful who fit such a description. Irene Adler, of course, but no, this handwriting is finer, colder, calculated rather than flamboyant. This woman is a scientist, not a performer." Watson looked from the note to Holmes, his heart pounding. "Then she's dangerous." Holmes stopped, turning sharply toward him. "Every mind that seeks mastery over time is dangerous, Watson, because such a person does not fear consequence, only delay." The fire popped and silence fell for a moment. Then Holmes picked up his coat and hat. "We're going to the Royal Observatory," he said quietly. "At this hour?" "At precisely this hour. For if she intends to strike at 12, she'll need the clock that rules them all, the one Armitage sought to corrupt, but never could. Time, as ever, will tell us everything." The fog outside had thickened to a pale wall. Their carriage rolled through it like a ghost, the sound of hooves muffled and strange. Big Ben's silhouette loomed faintly through the mist, its face dim but steady. When they reached Greenwich once more, the gates stood ajar. A single lantern burned near the base of the tower, swaying gently in the cold wind. Holmes dismounted without a word, eyes narrowing as he saw the faint outline of footprints in the frost. Delicate, narrow, deliberate. "Watson," he said softly, "the hour is nearly upon us." Watson followed his gaze upward. The great clock read 11:56. Holmes adjusted his gloves, his tone grave but electric with purpose. "Remember, my dear friend, when the hour strikes 12, we shall see not merely the end of Armitage's scheme, but perhaps the beginning of something far more intricate." As the fog thickened, swallowing their silhouettes, the tower's chime gave a soft, anticipatory groan, like a heart preparing for its final beat before revelation. And somewhere, unseen within the shadows of the mechanism above, a figure moved, silent, composed, watching the seconds fall away like dying embers of time itself.